Welcome to Shift, everybody. We're glad to see you whether you're in person or online. If you're here, you made it. You're safe. Just breathe. Also, you can scan this QR code or the one at the welcome table, and if you fill out the Connect card, we will send you some free Opus coffee. March 12th is the start of daylight savings and spring break, but don't worry, we got you. We're gonna have a relaxed service with coffee and donuts and a trivia game for the adults before the teaching and a PJ movie day for Treehouse. So don't worry about getting the kids ready. Just roll out of bed. And if you're in town, come on over and let's hang out. On March 25th, starting at 10 a.m., we're gonna have a work day. We'll be trimming up all the crepe myrtles and the sagos. He could have just said bushes or whatever, but that's showing his age, isn't it? Picking up any fallen limbs and hauling them off. So bring your work gloves and your tools and come help us clean up the property a little bit. Our next after shift is March 26th. We're gonna be hanging out after service and enjoying lunch available for purchase at the Egg and I food truck. We'll have music, tailgate games, and games for the kids too. Mark your calendars today so you don't miss out on all the fun. And that is all for today. So let's kick off our new series, Spring Cleaning.
This is by Brene Brown, and it says, "The shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection." And the Berkeley Institute of Wellbeing defines shame as, you can go to the next one. Oh, he's got it. Shame is a self-conscious emotion arising from the sense that something is fundamentally wrong about oneself. Guilt believes I did something bad, but shame believes that I am bad. So we feel guilty for what we did, but we feel ashamed for who we are. As a young boy, Gary was sent to live with his grandparents. Gary's father was an abusive alcoholic, and Gary's mom knew just how sensitive he was as a child. And when she became pregnant again, she kind of hatched this plan to send Gary off to live with her parents. Using the excuse that they had several kids, and with the new baby on the way, she was going to need help. And so she sent Gary off to live with the grandparents. And so that happened roughly elementary age, like second, third grade age. He was sent off to live with grandparents, and they went all over the world. He actually lived for a good amount of time in Germany with his grandparents. Gary's mom was doing the best that she could do with the situation that she was in. The problem is that she didn't tell Gary what was actually taking place. And so because she was trying to protect him, even though she was trying to protect him, Gary grew up believing that there was something wrong with him because his mother didn't want him. Gary was spared much of the abuse that his siblings endured, which created resentment within the family, which is a topic for another day. But that also fed into his belief that there was something wrong with him. And he carried that belief with him until the day that he died. And I know this because we talked about it all the time. A few weeks before his death, we went out for coffee, and he asked me, what if I get up there and stand before God and he tells me that I wasn't good enough? Today, we're going to start a new series that's leading into Easter called Spring Cleaning. And what we're doing is we're going to be taking a look at some of the scars, some of the baggage that we all carry with us. And we're going to be looking at how we go about beginning that healing process, whether it be through the work of Jesus or through the work of others. And so today, we're going to be talking about healing of shame. So when faced with shame, the brain reacts as if it were facing physical danger. All right, it triggers the sympathetic nerve system, which then creates that fight, flight, freeze response. All right, so for somebody that has that flight response, it triggers this need to disappear. All right. And a lot of times people will literally like shrink themselves physically so that whatever's taking place, they can feel like that they're not, right? They're invisible and they'll shut down. The freeze response is what normally occurs when people are faced with trauma where they feel trapped and powerless. Now, the good thing about this is that it allows us to survive where intolerable things are happening to us, but the freeze response also upsets our ability to think straight, to think clearly, which can result in the belief that we're stuck in a situation where we have no power because there's something wrong with us. It can cause us to believe that whatever's happening to us is our fault. Now, I personally don't typically have those responses. My brain kicks into fight. Okay. Now, before we move further, that's not any cooler than flight or freeze. All right, because the fight response expresses itself in verbal or behavioral aggression towards the person doing the shaming. Right. So if somebody's shaming me and I'm embarrassed, then my initial reaction is aggression. Every time I have somebody come at me, every time I have somebody that tells me that I can't do something or tells me that I'm not good enough, I immediately revert back to my 19-year-old self sitting in the dean's office of my small conservative Christian school, and him telling me that I am definitely not good enough and I'll never work in a church and nobody would ever hire somebody like me. It was the most shameful moment of my life, and I carry it with me to this day. It is embedded in my instinctual memory, and I react out of it all the time. And the reality is that I think to one degree or another, we all react out of some shame that we've experienced in our lives, right? We all react out of shame-based thinking. And here's just a few examples of what shame-based thinking looks like. First, we're vulnerable. Can you show that, bud? We're vulnerable to perfectionism, all right? We attempt to silence our shame with perfect performance, and then we find it really difficult to admit failure. For me, I over-prepare for things. I over-prepare for all of the stuff because if something goes wrong, it's not my fault because I've already prepared for it, right? It was outside of whatever I could have done, right? The second one, we're critical of ourselves, which drives us to become critical of others. Shamed people shame people. We hate in others the very things that we see in ourselves. Unfortunately, I do this with my children sometimes. I can be hard on them because I see things in them that are in me. I told you. I don't know how to go on for that. We'll just go to the next point. Yeah. How about this one? We use self-defeating thoughts to shield ourselves from disappointments. We focus on the worst possible outcomes so that that sabotages, and that ends up sabotaging opportunities or relationships. For me, this shows up in like these and maybe you'll resonate with this, but these crazy scenarios in my head. Like I know that I have to have this conversation, and in my head, it turns into this crazy argument, and we argue about stuff that literally will never happen. Do you do that? I'll do that in the shower. Like I will argue with myself as the person and then myself, and that conversation back and forth. Does anybody else do that? Yes. Okay, good. So I'm not crazy. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make with talks like these from people like me and places like this is that we reduce this to just a spiritual issue. We reduce it to just a spiritual issue. Now, are there things that we can do spiritually to help? Absolutely. For instance, I think that if we speak truth over ourselves about who God says we are, I think that's healthy. And here's just a few examples. We are God's masterpiece, a royal priesthood, children of God, a temple of God, a new creation, more than conquerors, sons and daughters of God, light of the world and sitting on a hill. I think that speaking truth over our life can help us battle shame, right? Um, I think it reminds us that our identity isn't based in something that we've done in the past or something that was done to us. I think it can remind us of this thing over here of who we actually are versus this shame-based thing. And for some, maybe that's enough to help get them out of shame-based thinking, right? But maybe it's not, and that's okay. More than okay, it's healthy. Because while we do what is wise spiritually, we cannot ignore that we need to do what's prudent physically. All right? Before we go on, I want to say this. I want to make this clear. I am not a trained counselor, and I am not offering professional advice. You may need to actually seek therapy or a professional, and we can help you connect you with somebody to do that, whether it be a therapist or psychiatrist or counselor. So as you speak truth over your life and seek God in prayer and meditation, I would like to offer some advice that I've been reading, and I've adapted this from a Dr. Beverly Engel. She's an author, internationally recognized psychotherapist, and an advocate for victims of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. All right. The first thing that she suggests is this: stop blaming yourself for the abuse. Too often, and I can't speak to everything, but I'm going to speak to like my experience, church, right? Too often, the church has perpetuated and sustained abuse with its doctrine and practices, all right? Take, for instance, I know somebody that this happened to. Women have been told to go back to abusive husbands and pray more. There have been many instances of pastors covering up abuse within the church. And once these women have worked up the courage to leave, they're shamed for getting a divorce. Victims of abuse have been told that the way to resolve abuse is to confront their pastoral abusers, because that's the biblical way of confrontation found in Matthew 18. Like if somebody harms you, you go to them one-on-one and then two-on-one. But all of this does is that it bullies people into silence and protecting the good name of the church, right? If a church leadership, hear me when I say this, if a church leadership requires you to sign some sort of membership contract or covenant, or worse yet, requires an NDA, run. Do not walk away from that space, all right? Run. The only thing this does is create scenarios in which victims become victimized all over again. And then they're forced to believe that they're the ones causing the problem. So whether the organizational church realizes it or not, all right, they are using the brain's shame response to their benefit. There is absolutely nothing a person can do that warrants someone emotionally or physically abusing them. You did not cause your abuser to mistreat you. The second thing that she suggests is this, is gain an understanding as to why you behaved as you did. Now, my friend Gary was never able to do this. One of his coping mechanisms was like this self-depreciating humor. He would make fun of himself all the time. My guess is that if he felt like if he made fun of himself first, it would short-circuit anybody else's ability to make fun of him, right? I have other ways to deal with the shame that I carried. For me, I would outwork anyone around me. Because if I was better than them, then I'm better than them, right? Like if my youth group grew more, if more kids came to my stuff, I'm better than all of you, and that's how I felt. That's what happened. But the result is that I ended up putting my family in like second and third place at times. I often made my wife feel like that the church was more important than she was, and that she was less than. Now, I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but that's what happened. Now, because how we get caught in these like shame-based thinking cycles, right, just this loop, that could feed into that. the realization of what I did to my wife and to my family could feed into that, right? Or instead of viewing myself as bad or that there's something wrong with me for acting out, I can begin to understand and view my negative behaviors as an attempt to cope with the shame that was forced on me. Now, I'm not bad. You're not bad. And we can recognize that the unhealthy things that we did in response to that shame may have hurt others, and understand that we did those things because not because we were actively trying to harm others, but because we were trying to protect ourselves. Like, we can hold those two things together and both be true and hold that in tension. When I was busy outworking everyone, being better than everyone, I didn't do that to hurt my wife. I was doing that to protect my 19-year-old teenager self who had just had his dreams ripped away from him. Now, once we realize what our unhealthy responses to shame does, right? Once we come to that realization, then we can begin to work towards healthy responses and begin to make amends to the people that we may have hurt by those unhealthy responses. Now, the last point I want to spend just a few minutes on, and mostly because I think that the church does a horrible job of teaching about this and often treats what we're going to talk about as heretical. The church often talks about Jesus' words found in Matthew chapter 22. Could you show that? And it says this: Jesus has just got done telling them what the greatest commandment is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he says this, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, when we talk about this, mostly the focus is always on how you love your neighbor, right? But if we take Jesus at his words here, how we love our neighbor hangs on how we love ourselves. Love of neighbor is tied to love of self, all right? In her book, Daring Greatly, go ahead and show this, buddy. Brene Brown says, if we are going to find our way out of shame and back to each other, vulnerability is the path and courage is the light. To set down those lists of what we're supposed to be is brave. To love ourselves and support each other in the process of becoming real is perhaps the greatest single act of daring greatly. And I think that begins with showing ourselves some self-compassion and forgiveness. We have to show ourselves self-compassion and forgiveness. Compassion is the antidote to shame. All right? It acts to neutralize the poison of shame, to remove those toxins created by shame. To love yourself is to show self-compassion. The goal is to treat yourself in a loving, kind, and supportive way. Ask yourself this question. If you struggle with this, ask yourself this question. Would you treat a friend the way that you treat yourself? Think about somebody that you love, a friend or family member. Would you treat that person the way that you treat yourself? Would you say something to that person? Would you talk to them the way that you talk to yourself or think about yourself in here? Would you say those things out loud to your neighbor? And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to be just as compassionate to yourself as you would be to other people. Now, forgiving yourself isn't about letting yourself off the hook or just making excuses for negative behavior. It's not dismissing the very real harm that it may have caused. The more that you heal from shame, the more that you will actually see yourself. And the more that you see yourself, the more you begin to live in this new humanity that Jesus brought to us. Forgiving yourself creates the ability to recognize guilt from shame. And guilt is I feel bad about what I did. Shame is I feel bad because I'm bad. To love yourself is to forgive. And just like you may have to forgive someone or something that was, a scenario, and you have to choose that forgiveness over and over and over. And for some of us, that forgiveness process may be lifelong. It's not going to be just this one-time event. I think that we have to choose forgiveness for ourselves over and over and over. And maybe it is a lifetime process, that whenever something happens and we're reminded of this thing that brings us shame, that we continually forgive ourselves over and over. Now, for those of you that spent any time in the church or grew up in church, you might be thinking that loving myself feels wrong. I don't know if anybody else can resonate with that. That loving it, we're told to die to self. And that means not to love yourself, right? It means to put yourself down here. I was taught that I needed to lay down my hopes and my desires and my wants and my dreams because God didn't care about any of that stuff, which means I put myself down here, right? I was taught, pick up your cross, right? Get ready to die, which meant I put myself down here. All these phrases used to put myself down here. But maybe those things don't mean what we've been taught them to mean. I mean, how could they mean that? How could they mean that? Jesus said his burden was light and his yoke is easy. He said that his truth brings freedom, that he was here to set the oppressed free. And I can promise you the way that those things are taught do not accomplish any of those things. I say that because Jesus gave us permission to love ourselves. Look at the second half of that. Not only permission, but it's part of the second greatest commandment behind only love of God. In fact, they are so tied together that we love God by loving neighbor, and how we love neighbor is tied to how we love ourselves. Listen, shame lives and grows in the dark, in silence, in blame. That's where shame feeds itself. To show ourselves love and forgiveness, we must drag shame out into the light and expose it to love. For some of us, that means places like this, right? Like we can have that moment here. We can have this spiritual experience together, and you can symbolically or emotionally choose to expose your shame to light and to love right here. You can do that. For others, it's going to take more than that, right? It's going to take more than just a one-time experience. It's going to take a professional to help guide you through that process. Both are okay. More than that, both are just as holy and sacred paths to healing. Love, hear me when I say this, love of self is not heretical or sinful. It is foundational to living healthier, holier lives. We love God by loving our neighbor, and we love our neighbor by how we love ourselves. And shame does not allow us to do that. Shame does not allow us to do that. Be kind to yourself. Don't blame yourself for what happened to you. Give yourself some grace and understand why you reacted out of the shame, and then respond to that understanding with compassion and forgiveness. You are good and holy and worthy of love. So this morning, for our time of reflection, for those of you who are all that are new, we don't have an invitation at the end of service. Basically, here in just a moment, the band's going to start playing. I'm going to ask you some questions to reflect upon. The first question that I thought about for this time of reflection is, and for some, I just want to let you know, some of these might be difficult questions. The first is this: what shame are you holding on to? What shame are you holding on to? For me, when I was going through this, I had to think about sitting in that office, listening to that jackwagon speak. We've made amends. And even then, I still carry it with me. Do you know what I mean? So what shame are you holding on to? The second question that I thought about was, what is keeping you from bringing that shame into the light? What is it about that shame, that particular thing that keeps you from exposing it to light and to love? The final question that I have for you guys this morning in our time of reflection is this. What is one step that you can make right now to expose that shame to love of self and to love of God? Part of the reason the cross was such a dominant weapon was the shame that it created. Not only was it excruciating pain, but it was a shameful death. It shamed the person on the cross, but also the family of the person being crucified. It was a powerful deterrent. The author of the New Testament letter Hebrews talks about this. In chapter 12, they say this. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people, then you won't become weary and give up. And it talks about him disregarding that shame. The cross was a symbol of the brokenness and shame found in our systems. The cross is a symbol, hear that again, it is a symbol of the brokenness and shame that is inherently built into the world's systems. And he disregarded it. When it says he disregarded it, it means that he hated it. He scorned it. He brushed it aside. All of that shame that was found on the cross. And all of that the cross symbolizes from the beginning of time till now, Jesus just brushes it aside. The shame that we wrestle with. All of our hurts and all of our failures, all of our disappointments, Jesus scorns, disregards, and hates. And on your seats, you're going to find these small symbols, little tokens. These symbols are symbols of a healing atonement, of Jesus taking all of that shame and hurt into himself, Jesus pressing all of his divinity into our humanity so that we might participate and live in his new healed humanity. And everybody, this symbolic table is open to anyone willing to participate. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pray, and the band will continue to play, and when you're ready, if you're wanting to, take communion. Let's pray. God of light and love, today we come before you open and honest, laid bare. We all carry scars of shame of things that we've done, and the shame of things done to us. Empower us to drag those things into your light, to expose them to your love. Give us access to those that can help us do this in healthy, sustainable ways, and heal us from these wounds. Forgive us when we act out of toxic shame, and help us forgive ourselves. Bring us back into harmony with you, with ourselves, and with our neighbor. And thank you for the healing work of Jesus. May we begin to live resurrection in our lives today. We pray all of this and more in your name. Amen.